I hadn't planned on coming back to Hollow Creek. Not really. Not after everything that happened when I was younger, and not after I swore I'd left this place behind for good. But you know how life is. It doesn't care about your promises. It just pulls you back to the places you'd rather forget. I drove into town on a gray afternoon, the kind where the clouds feel too heavy and low, pressing down on everything. The welcome sign was the same as when I was a kid, just chipped wood with faded paint. Welcome to Hollow Creek. Pop. 1482. The number was wrong. I could feel it before I even reached Main Street. Too many houses looked empty. Too many windows were dark, even though it wasn't late yet. The streets felt smaller than I remembered, but quieter too. I parked outside the old general store, half expecting to see the place bustling. Instead, the shelves inside were thin, the cashier distracted, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. I bought a coffee just to feel normal. It was bitter, stale, and lukewarm. As I left, I heard someone call my name. It was Mrs. Keene, the woman who used to live 3 doors down from us when I was a kid. Her face was lined deeper than I remembered, her back bent, but her eyes, those were sharp. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask about my parents. The first thing out of her mouth was, "Don't forget the rules." I almost laughed, but her expression killed the sound in my throat. "You still have those written down somewhere?" I asked, trying to joke. She didn't smile. "They're not a joke." She pointed with a trembling finger toward the community board across the street. I walked over, curiosity prickling, and there it was, a faded, yellowed flyer tacked to the board, edges curling with age. At first, I thought it was some leftover church notice or town fair announcement. But no, it was something else entirely. In bold black letters, someone had written, "The 6 rules of Hollow Creek. Never be outside after 9:17 p.m. Do not look directly at the man by the lamppost. If you hear knocking after midnight, never answer. Keep all mirrors covered at night. Never enter the woods when the cicadas are silent. Always greet the watchman if you see him." That was it. No explanations. Just the rules. I stood there for a while, staring at them. They looked ridiculous, like something you'd hear kids whisper on a playground to scare each other. But the longer I looked, the stranger I felt. The air around me seemed heavier. A man walking past slowed when he saw me looking, then quickly turned his eyes away, muttering under his breath. Mrs. Keene was still standing there. "Don't test them," she said. Her voice wasn't threatening, it was pleading. "Don't ever test them." I wanted to ask her 100 questions, but she shuffled off before I could. That night, I lay in the old family house, listening to the familiar groans of the wooden frame as it settled. The place hadn't changed much. Same crooked hallway, same smell of dust, same trees scratching the siding when the wind blew. But it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt watched, and for the first time since leaving this place, I remembered how Hollow Creek had always carried whispers. Whispers about people who went missing, about nights you didn't go outside, about things you weren't supposed to look at. The rules sounded absurd on paper, but in Hollow Creek, they weren't treated like stories. They were treated like survival. The first night back in Hollow Creek should have been ordinary. I told myself that 100 times. After all, I was just visiting, just another evening in a quiet town, nothing more. But even as the sky dimmed and the clouds turned bruised purple, I couldn't shake the unease. I'd gone to the diner on Main Street, Mabel's, the same greasy spoon that had been there since I was a kid. The neon sign flickered just like it always had, buzzing faintly as if it could die at any second. Inside, the booths were cracked, the pie case half empty. A few people sat hunched over their food, not talking, not laughing, just eating. It wasn't until I left, pushing open the glass door and stepping into the cool night air, that I realized how late it had gotten. I checked my phone. 9:08 del pomeriggio. That number 9:17 flashed uninvited into my mind. Rule 1. Never be outside after 9:17 p.m. I tried to laugh at myself. Rules on a bulletin board. Nothing more. Just local superstition. But my walk back to the old family house suddenly felt longer than I remembered. The streets were empty. Too empty. And then I saw him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow, maybe. But no there. At the edge of Main Street, under the only working lamppost in the row, stood a figure. Tall. Unnaturally tall. He didn't move. He didn't sway like a drunk, or shuffle like an old man. He just stood, motionless, his head tilted slightly forward as though he were studying the ground. I froze. My chest went tight, and then, as if some buried part of me had always known, Rule 2 surfaced in my mind like a warning siren. Do not look directly at the man by the lamppost. I snapped my gaze away so fast it made my neck ache. My pulse hammered. I told myself, don't look, just walk. And I did. I forced my legs to move, one after the other. My shoes scraped the pavement louder than they should have. But curiosity, it's a cruel thing. It doesn't listen to reason. Halfway down the block, I broke the rule. I stole a glance. He was still there, standing in the circle of weak light. Only now his head was bent further, as though his neck had folded in on itself. Too far, too sharp. No human neck bends like that. And though his face was hidden in shadow, I swear, the darkness of him was darker than the night around it, as if he weren't standing under the light at all, but pulling it inward, swallowing it whole. My stomach turned. My legs nearly buckled. I tore my gaze away and walked faster, fighting the urge to run. By the time I reached the old house, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I shut it behind me and leaned against it, chest heaving. The silence inside was worse than the street. That's when I heard the faintest scraping sound. It came from the hallway. I swallowed, forcing myself to look. There, halfway down the corridor, was the mirror my parents had always kept hanging, only now it was draped in a sheet. I hadn't done that. The cloth shifted, just slightly, like something beneath had brushed against it. I almost reached for the edge, almost lifted it to see what was underneath, but the rules echoed in my skull. Keep all mirrors covered at night. For the first time, I didn't think of them as folklore. I thought of them as protection. I turned away, heart pounding, and whispered to myself in the dark, don't break them again. The following week, I learned something important about Hollow Creek. Everyone here still goes to the meetings. It had been the same when I was a kid, though back then I barely understood it. Every Thursday evening, like clockwork, the church basement filled with people. Back then, I thought it was just a social thing, like bingo nights or neighborhood potlucks. But now, returning as an adult, I noticed the difference immediately. It wasn't fellowship. It was surveillance. The basement smelled of damp stone and candle wax. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, and every seat was taken. I slid into the back, unnoticed at first. Heads turned eventually, though eyes that lingered too long, expressions that weren't exactly welcoming but weren't openly hostile either. It felt like every person was silently checking me off some invisible list. Nobody joked, nobody whispered, nobody scrolled on their phones. The sheriff, broad-shouldered and stone-faced, stood at the front. He didn't open with prayers or announcements. He just repeated the rules, slowly, one by one, like scripture. Never be outside after 9:17 p.m. Do not look directly at the man by the lamppost. If you hear knocking after midnight, never answer. Keep all mirrors covered at night. Never enter the woods when the cicadas are silent. Always greet the watchman if you see him. The words were etched into the room. People nodded, some under their breath, others with their eyes closed, as though absorbing each syllable. I tried to look casual, tried to look like I belonged, but the hair on my neck prickled when I realized there was no skepticism here. Not a hint. They all believed. They all lived by them. And then, in the far back corner of the basement, I saw him. The watchman. No one introduced him. No one looked directly at him. But I felt his presence before my eyes found him. A man in a long brown coat, worn at the cuffs, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His skin looked pale, almost colorless, as though the blood had long since drained from it. His eyes, when they finally lifted to meet mine, were too pale, a washed-out gray that made my stomach twist. Rule 6 burned in my head. Always greet the watchman if you see him. I didn't want to. My mouth felt dry, my tongue heavy. But some instinct stronger than fear made me nod, whispering the smallest word I could manage. Evening. His lips twitched, a smile, not wide, not threatening, relieved, as if my acknowledgement had just lifted a great weight. The sheriff finished reading the rules. The room stayed silent for a long beat before chairs scraped, people rising in practiced order. No chatter, no small talk. Everyone left, as though the act of hearing the rules was enough for them to continue living. I stayed in my seat, shaken, watching the watchman as he drifted toward the door. For a moment, I thought he might pass by me, but he didn't. He paused, tilted his head, and in a voice like paper tearing, he said, You remembered. Then he left, his footsteps echoing longer than they should have, fading into the stone walls. That night, lying awake in the house, I understood something. The rules weren't symbolic. They weren't lessons or metaphors. They were literal. Each one was a wall between us and something waiting to break in. And if I had failed to greet him, I don't think I'd still be here to tell you this story. I met Danny again 2 days after the church meeting, though met isn't the right word. He found me. I was on my porch steps with a chipped mug of coffee, watching the late morning light filter through the maples. Cicadas buzzed so loud it felt like a blanket of sound was laid across town. For a second, it almost fooled me into believing Hollow Creek was normal. Danny strolled up the walk like it was any other Saturday, and not the middle of a slow, careful emergency everyone pretended was life. He was around my age, lean and long-armed from years at the mill, with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Back from the big city," he said, like he was reciting a line he'd practiced in the mirror. "They called it right you'd come back eventually." "I'm not staying," I told him, and tasted the lie as soon as I said it. Maybe I was trying to convince the house as much as him. He pointed his chin toward the street, where the community board leaned like a tired sentinel. "You seen our commandments?" He said it like a joke. "We got ourselves a whole religion now." I didn't answer. The rules on the flyer felt too close to my skin. He noticed and grinned wider. "First chance I get, I'm tearing those stupid sheets off my mirrors," he said. "Slept in the living room last night and the damn thing was wrapped like a corpse. I want my house to look like a house, not a funeral parlor." "Don't," I said before I could stop myself. The word came out too fast. "Don't?" He laughed. "Come on, you know it's fear. That's all this place sells anymore." He tapped his temple. "Once fear gets in here, it starts telling you what's real." "Who covered them?" I asked. "Old lady from next door," he said. Knocked like she was serving a warrant. "It's for your safety, Daniel." He mimicked her quaver. I let her do it to keep the peace, but I'm done. He lifted a hand, shading his eyes. "You want to come over and help me free the glass? Or you're afraid of catching religion?" "I'm not coming," I said. "Suit yourself." He winked. "Stay afraid. That's how the rules like you." He turned to leave. When he reached the sidewalk, he looked back and added, almost as an afterthought, "You see the man at the lamppost. You tell him I'm not bowing either." I didn't answer. I watched him go, listening to cicadas sing like they were warning the sun to keep moving. By late afternoon, the heat broke, a cool breath of air coming off the creek. I walked to the corner store for bread and found Sheriff Mathers on the steps, arms crossed, jaw working at nothing. He stared at the street like it might try something. "Evening," I said. I didn't add sheriff, because here, words confer obligations. He flicked his eyes toward me. "You tell Danny to keep his mirrors covered?" "He told me he's taking them down." Mathers's face didn't change. He might as well have been carved from the same wood as the steps. "Some people can't be helped," he said. "They only learn by losing." "What does that mean?" "It means what it means," he said, and pushed past me into the store. The sun slid lower. At 7:40, the streetlights rattled themselves awake. The one at the end of my block did what it always did, flickered, hesitated, then settled into a weak cone of light that looked too fragile to be useful. I avoided looking at it. I didn't need the reminder. Around 8:30, from across the street, a woman's voice rose. "Danny, leave it be." I crossed to the sidewalk without meaning to. Danny's house sat 2 doors down, a narrow one-story with blue paint peeling in long curls. Through the front window, I could see the white shroud draped over the living room mirror. Danny stood in front of it with his arms spread, grinning at the neighbor like he was about to saw a lady in half. "It's plastic and superstition," he called cheerfully. "Plastic I can fix." He pinched the tape at the top corner and ripped it free. The sheet slid with a dry hiss, catching on the frame, then slumping to the floor. Every hair along my arms lifted. The mirror was old glass, the kind that never reflects right. You could stand dead center and still come away with a face that looked a little borrowed. Now it showed Danny, and the room around him, and our crooked little town behind that. Something else, too, something like heat shimmer, as if a summer road ran right through the silver backing. "See?" he said, turning to us. "No monsters. No." He stopped. His eyes flicked back to the mirror. I couldn't see his face in the glass anymore. I saw his outline, but wrong, stretched like taffy, shoulders pulled longer than they should be. The shimmer on the surface tightened, like saran wrap drawn over a bowl. "Danny," the neighbor said softly. She had both hands pressed to her chest. "Put the sheet back." He laughed, but it sounded weaker. "You all hear yourselves? It's a mirror." He lifted his hand and touched the glass with 2 fingers. The surface rippled, not like glass, like pond water after a stone. The ripples ran outward in perfect circles, reached the frame, then came back. He jerked his hand away. "Static," he muttered, as if giving himself an explanation might change the thing itself. "Cover it," the neighbor said. "Please." Something knocked inside the mirror. It was small, polite, a sound like someone's knuckles tapping softly from the wrong side of glass. The neighbor screamed. I didn't. My voice had gone somewhere inside my ribcage and shut the door. Danny's mouth twitched. He looked at us, then back to the mirror with a child's fascination. "Okay, I'll bite," he said, and placed his palm flat on the surface. His reflection, his wrong, elongated reflection, didn't match him. It lifted its hand slower, as if deciding whether to cooperate. Then it pressed palm to palm with him, on the inside of the silver. I took a step forward without knowing I'd moved. The cicadas outside droned on. The lamppost hummed. In the mirror, Danny's reflection turned its head toward me before he did. He jerked back. The surface clung to his hand like jelly, strings stretching, then snapping as he tore free. His palm left a damp shape on the glass. When he glanced down, there was moisture on his skin. It wasn't water. It smelled faintly metallic, like blood, but thinner, colder. "That's enough," I said. Actual words this time. "Put the sheet up. Now." He stared at me like I'd switched languages. Pride warred with a tremor in his jaw. He bent to grab the sheet. The mirror tapped again. Faster. Then again. Then all at once. Tap, 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 tap. Just like frantic fingers trying to get attention from a deep well. Danny froze. His reflection smiled. Not him. Not any human smile. It lifted its wrong hand and motioned. A tiny, "come here" gesture that looked childish and obscene. I didn't realize I'd crossed the threshold until my shoe hit his mat, Danny said, almost pleading. "You see it too, right? It's not just me. I see it," I said. "Then," he whispered, as if the mirror needed quiet to hear. "Then, who teaches who?" He stepped closer to the glass. The neighbor sobbed. Somewhere on the sidewalk, a voice I knew but didn't see said, "Back away from it, Daniel." The sheriff's voice, flat as iron. Danny didn't. He leaned so near the surface that his breath fogged it, and the fog didn't cling, it sank, like mist falling into a lake. His reflection lifted its head in sync, then a half beat off, then not at all. It was choosing. "What happens if I push?" he said softly. I grabbed his elbow. It felt shockingly warm. "Don't test it," I said. "Don't test the rules. They're not rules," he said. "They're a story everyone tells to keep everyone else small." He wrenched his arm away and pressed both hands against the mirror. The glass, if it was glass, took him up to the wrists like a mouth. His face spasmed with surprise, then delight, then something that looked very much like fear. He tried to pull back. The mirror didn't release him. The surface around his arms tightened, dimples popping in like fingers pressing from inside. "Help," he said. It was a child's voice. It made the room tilt. I grabbed him under the arms and heaved. The neighbor caught his shoulder. We pulled. For a second it worked. We dragged his elbows back over the edge, the surface stretching like a film. Under his skin, something crawled, like hands pushing back from inside his forearms, looking for purchase. Behind me, boots thudded on the porch. Sheriff Mathers stepped into the room with 3 men, each carrying a 2x4 like a clumsy cross. He took one look and said, "Let go." "What?" I gasped. "Let him go," he repeated. His voice was neither cruel nor kind. It was official. He looked too long. I didn't. The neighbor didn't. We dug in. Danny's breath hitched, turned ragged. The surface creaked, and a line cracked across it, not a break, exactly, but a seam that widened. And from within, darkness, like ocean water at night. Then the mirror did something I will never be able to explain without sounding like a liar. It inhaled. The sheet on the floor lifted slightly toward it. The curtains fluttered toward it. Our shirts tugged toward it. Danny's shoulders jolted forward an inch, then 2, and the sound he made wasn't human. It wasn't pain. It was recognition. "Danny," I said, sobbing now. "Please." He turned his head. For a heartbeat his eyes found mine, and I saw 1,000 arguments leave his face all at once. He didn't say sorry. He didn't say I was right. He said, "Tell my mother I kept the porch light on." Then something inside the mirror gripped him, not gently this time, and pulled. His arms slid in to the elbows, then biceps, then shoulders, like he was being threaded through a hole too small for him but determined anyway. The neighbor screamed his name until it was only a noise. I kept my hands on his waist even when my nails ripped skin. I kept them there until I felt something cold slide under my fingers from inside his back, and then I let go because I am not brave enough to hold on to a man being swallowed by his reflection. He went in, up to his neck. He didn't fight then. He went very still. For a fraction of a second, his head rested against the surface like a person dozing on train glass. Then the film took his jaw, his mouth, his eyes, the crown of his head, and he was gone. The mirror, if that's what we can keep calling it, went flat again. Half a dozen perfectly circular ripples ran through it, slow as clock hands. Each one faded until the surface was as calm as an old lake at dusk. We stood there, breathing like we'd outrun a storm. The neighbor slid down the wall and made a sound I didn't know people could make while still living. Sheriff Mathers let out a slow breath and nodded to the men with him. They moved like a crew that had practiced this, maybe more than once. "Board it," he said. "Wait." I choked, because my brain was hunting for ordinary tasks. Call someone. Call. I didn't know who. A priest? A scientist? A glazier? Mathers shook his head. "We don't involve outsiders." He glanced at me, and the glance said more than his words. "You know why." The men set the 2x4s in place, bare wood against the frame, and began to nail them in, the hammer blows loud enough to feel in my teeth. With each strike, the surface shivered. Not a reflection ripple this time. A shudder of irritation, like a living thing, sent the tremor back through the nails into their wrists. A nail bent. One man cursed. Mathers took the hammer and finished the job himself, his face expressionless, as if he were building a fence and not sealing a mouth. When the boards were across, they affixed a final plank diagonally, corner to corner. Mathers produced a brush and a little can from his pocket. The old man came prepared and painted quick black strokes over the boards. It took me a second to recognize the shape. A circle bisected by a line, then crossed by another, then another, until it looked like a sun with no light, a sign against seeing. The room felt different after that, thick but less hungry. "Everyone out," he said quietly. The neighbor tried to rush the boards, palms open like she could press him back into the room from the other side. Mathers caught her and held on until the fight drained. He guided her gently to the porch. The men followed. I stayed, rooted. Mathers looked at me, then passed me to the boards. "He chose to look," he said, and then he chose to keep looking. A pause. "We won't tear the house down. People need shelter more than they need ghosts, but no one opens that door again. You can't just..." I began, but the argument had no feet. He touched the brim of a hat he didn't wear. "Habit. Go home," he said. "Get rest." Outside, a handful of neighbors stood with arms folded, faces set in that Hollow Creek way that admits grief but not surprise. Someone passed me like I was furniture. Someone else said, "Told him, didn't we? Told him." Not cruel. Resigned. They nailed Danny's front door shut from the outside too, crossboards branded with the same black sign. The hammers rang down the block, and with each blow the cicadas swelled louder, as if their choir were trying to cover the sound, or drown it, or answer it with something older. I walked home without feeling my feet. The lamppost at the end of the street glared its weak light, and I kept my eyes on the sidewalk because I had already broken Rule 2 once, and my body understood what it had risked. When I reached my gate, I paused and looked back at Danny's house. It looked fine, ordinary. A blue one-story with fresh boards on a door like so many houses that had weathered floods or storms. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know. But I knew, and the knowing sat down in my chest and made itself comfortable. In my hallway, the sheet over our mirror hung crooked, the tape loosening where humidity had worked its little knives. I pressed it back, smoothing the edges, pretending my palm didn't shake. Something brushed the other side, just a whisper of pressure. Maybe it was my imagination leaning on itself. Maybe it wasn't. I took a thumbtack from the kitchen drawer and pinned the cloth tight in the corners. Then I did the same for the bedroom mirror, even though it hadn't slipped. Then I walked through the house like a firefighter, looking for ghost flames, touching each covering, tugging each knot, checking each shade. When I finally sat on the edge of my bed, the night had deepened to that heavy blue that swallows edges. The digital clock on my dresser showed 11, 58 inches red digits, 2 minutes to midnight. My chest had learned a new breathing. The sound filled the room. I told myself that the worst had already happened, that Danny had done the stupidest thing a person could do in Hollow Creek, and there was nothing left to prove. I told myself rules were simple, and I knew them now, and simple things protect you if you let them. Somewhere down the block, faint at first, I heard the brittle pop of a streetlight cycling, then another. Then silence fell in a way that wasn't quiet. The cicadas stopped. My skin went cold. I lay back without moving and stared at the ceiling, because I knew another rule was watching the clock now, waiting to see whether I would obey. I counted to 60. I counted to 60 again, because I needed to fill the space with numbers that did not belong to anything else. At 12:04, the first knock came at my front door. Slow, polite. I closed my eyes. I didn't answer. The second knock was softer, like someone touching wood with the back of their knuckles. Then a third, at the hall window. Then a fourth, somewhere I couldn't place, maybe the bathroom door, maybe the inside of my skull. "Sweetheart," a voice called through the house, warm and worn at the edges. My mother's voice. I kept breathing. I kept counting. I kept the rules lined up in my head like soldiers. Outside, something dragged itself along the porch rail, a soft wooden squeal. Inside, behind the sheet, the hallway mirror gave a small, eager sound, like a tongue tasting. I didn't move. The knocking went around the house, past my bedroom wall, then to the back door, then to the closet, then to the door I was staring at with my eyes closed. It made a road of sound around me, circling, patient. The voice that wasn't my mother's got the timing of her words almost right. Almost. "Open the door, love," it called. "You're safe with me." I lay still and let the rule be larger than my fear. And after a long while the knocks stopped, and the silence that followed smelled like cold and old wood, and something I didn't have a word for but would have called hunger if hunger had a scent. I didn't sleep. I waited, breath by breath, for the thin seam of dawn to pry the night open. When it came raw and gray. I made coffee with shaking hands and carried the cup to the porch. Danny's house sat quiet, boards dark with dew. A line of ants walked along the edge of his step like nothing had happened to the man who had fed them sugar from his palm. Mrs. Keene shuffled by on her morning route. She didn't look at me. She looked at the sun like it was a promise someone might break. "People disappear," she said to no one, "but nothing ever leaves." I wanted to ask what that meant. I wanted to ask 1,000 things. Instead, I went back inside, checked every mirror, every sheet, every tack. I whispered each rule in order, as if the words themselves had weight. And when I reached Rule 3, my throat went tight, because now I knew how easy it would be to fail it, how easy it would be to open a door to the wrong voice and be pulled across a line you didn't see. That night, at 11:57, I sat on the floor with my back against my bedroom door and waited. I knew what came next. I made it a habit to say the rules out loud before the sun went down. It wasn't a prayer. It was a checklist, a pilot's pre-flight ritual, because once night lifted off, there wasn't time to learn which switch mattered. Never be outside after 9:17 p.m. Do not look directly at the man by the lamppost. If you hear knocking after midnight, never answer. Keep all mirrors covered at night. Never enter the woods when the cicadas are silent. Always greet the watchman if you see him. I spoke them at the kitchen sink, hands damp, breath tracing the cool on the window. The sky above Hollow Creek wore that thin purple sheen you get just before full dark, when the town looks normal if you squint and then stops looking like anything you know. Streetlights stuttered alive one by one, and the one at the end of my block buzzed, coughed light, and held. I ate a sandwich I couldn't taste, walked the rooms one more time, and pressed the sheets tight over each mirror. My mother's old vanity in the spare room had a skirted mirror I'd forgotten about. I dragged a pillowcase over it and taped it in place. The hallway mirror got 4 new thumbtacks, one in each corner. One dead center for luck I didn't believe in but used anyway. The bathroom mirror was already hidden behind a taped trash bag that looked ridiculous in daylight and necessary now. The cicadas sang. Loud, layered, almost physical. Their sound filled every seam in the walls. I told myself that if they kept singing, I'd get through the night. They stopped at 11:51. It wasn't a fade. It was a cut. 1 second 1,000 tinfoil voices. The next, a silence, that felt like someone pressing a palm over the town's mouth. I stood still in the hallway, palms flat to the plaster, head tilted like a dog listening for thunder. No wind, no crickets, no passing cars. Just the refrigerator's soft motor, the slow tick of the kitchen clock, and my own breathing getting louder than either. I turned off the hall light and sat on the floor against my bedroom door with my knees up. Rule 3 hadn't said anything about where to sit, but I wanted a barrier between me and the house, something I could feel if anything tried the knob. The digital clock on the dresser showed 11, 58 inches, red numbers that looked like they wanted to bleed. I tried not to think about Danny. I tried not to think about whether mirrors behind cloth could still see, or whether the cloth was for me and not them. I tried to remember my mother's voice and couldn't decide if I wanted to. When midnight clicked, nothing happened. When 12:01 rolled over, nothing happened. At 12:04, the first knock came. It was soft, almost polite. 3 spaced taps against the front door like someone with good manners who didn't want to be a bother. I didn't move. Breath in, breath out. I felt like a child hiding under a blanket while a parent checked the room for monsters, the blanket thin, but sacred if I believed hard enough. Another 3 knocks, same rhythm, then a pause long enough to hear the blood in my ears. "Sweetheart?" A voice called through the house. My mother's voice. Not how she'd sounded sick at the end, how she sounded in the kitchen when I was 10 and came home with grass stains on my knees. A smile you could hear. No. My hands tried to move without me, palms searching for the floor so I could push myself up. I dug nails into the carpet instead. The rule didn't say, "Never open for strangers." It said, "Never answer." No clarifications, no exceptions, no loopholes for voices you loved. The doorknob to my bedroom twitched. Not enough to rattle, enough to say, "I know where you are." The front door knocked again. Louder this time, not polite anymore. Someone ran their fingers along the porch rail wood against rings, and then the knock traveled. Living room window, kitchen door, hallway wall, like it was walking the perimeter with one long arm, trailing the nails. "Open the door," the voice said, closer now. "Why would you lock me out?" I closed my eyes to make my ears bigger. The words were right. The tone was right. The breath at the end of each word was wrong. A hair too fast. Like audio that had been compressed and played back at 98% speed. A picture frame clicked on the hallway wall as air moved where air shouldn't. The sheet over the mirror brushed the glass in a slow exhale. "Please," she said. "It's cold." I stayed still and counted. The rules felt like a ledge, and the house felt like the drop. I got to 60 and kept counting. It didn't matter. Time didn't matter. Night in Hollow Creek had its own clock. The voice went to the kitchen window. "I made your favorite," it said cheerfully. "You remember? The apple cake you and Danny liked so much?" The voice laughed, sweet and tiny. "Cut the edges off for you." I almost laughed too, because my mother hated wasting food and never cut edges off anything. The laugh got stuck sideways in my throat. The voice wasn't guessing. It was scraping memory for details and putting them in the wrong places, like a child arranging bones by color. Knuckles touched the bedroom door. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't answer. I didn't shift my weight. I became a hinge holding my own weight up with the rule's weight on top of me. The door warmed where my shoulder pressed it. On the other side, something colder than wood waited. The voice didn't beg or shout now. It practiced. It tried me on in different rooms and ages. At the front door again. "Sweetheart, I forgot my keys. I don't want to wake the neighbors." At the kitchen. "It's me, your mother. Are you being silly?" At the hallway mirror. "Look at me. Come on, one peek." At the closet. "You can't hide in there forever." I flinched at that last one because the closet door was 4 feet from my face, and I hadn't heard it move. It didn't move now, either. It breathed. Just one, shallow in-out, like a lung remembering itself. I pressed my hand flat to the floor and felt vibration I couldn't place. A hum too low to be mechanical. The same tone I'd heard once at the train station when a freight rolled through without slowing. The house had become an instrument held on one long note. The knocking stopped. I didn't relax. Silence is never a gift here. Silence is a held breath. I counted to 106. At 107, the front door groaned. Not hinges, wood grain. I kept my hand on the carpet and felt a slow push, like the house was flexing around a weight. The knob didn't turn. The deadbolt didn't shift. The door frame loosened a fraction anyway, and something pressed its shadow under the seam where the threshold was never perfect. It was just a dark triangle at first, a softness where there should be a straight line. Then the triangle extended inward across the floor like a spill, slow and steady and without light. It reached the thin rectangle of moonlight on the entry rug and should have been broken by it. It wasn't. It slid through the light and came out the other side without thinning. Light became thinner around it. I had a vision of that shadow oozing across my hall, finding my bare foot and deciding that skin was a door. My toes curled into the carpet without me telling them to. "Open," the voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. Not my mother's anymore. Not anyone's. Just a mouth behind every wall trying shapes. I reached behind me with 2 fingers and found the edge of the dresser where I'd left the little hand mirror from the bathroom, its sheet taped on tight. I dragged it closer like a shield. It was stupid maybe, but it felt like pointing a cross at a wolf and hoping religion remembered you. The shadow under the doorframe paused, not retreating, considering. The thin cloth on the hand mirror rasped under my thumb as I pressed. Something tapped back from inside the mirror, one small, testing knock. "No," I said aloud, and surprised myself with the steadiness of it. "Not tonight." The sound stopped. The shadow under the front door gathered itself, pulling the edges in like a creature exhaling. It did not leave. It coiled. The wood creaked as the pressure changed. I pictured it folding itself into a shape that could wait until I slipped, and it didn't. Somewhere on the street, a car started. Headlights swept by in 2 pale smears beneath my curtains, and then were gone, too fast. The driver never slowed, never looked at Danny's boarded windows, never looked at anything. Out past the lamppost, the road curved toward the woods, and I imagined cones of light breaking off like sticks in a stream as the forest's edge bent them. 3 long minutes passed, or 30 seconds, or 2 hours. Time didn't matter. What mattered was not answering. The first rain hit at 12:19, a single slap of water on the porch roof like a palm, then another, then a steady rattle. The storm I'd seen waiting all evening finally stepping in like a tired guest. Water found the gutters and ran through them, a thin river that made the house sound less empty. I didn't trust the comfort. The storm had only given the knocking another mouth. "Let me in," the voice called, lightly above the rain. "You'll get sick sitting there." I stayed against the door. Water had a smell when it hit hot dust, and I breathed it, and it helped a little. The shadow thinned, but I couldn't tell if that was real or because of the way rain blurs edges. On the dresser, my phone buzzed once. A text, then another. I don't know what made me pick it up. Maybe the need to hold something human-made. The screen lit my hand, a winter color. The texts were from an unknown number. "You up? Hey, open the door a sec. It's me, Mom." I turned the phone face down and slid it under my thigh. The voice in the hall didn't imitate laughter this time. It made a sound like light bulbs exploding miles away. "You learned," it said finally, and the words were almost tender. "We like that here." The rain filled the gutters and then overfilled them, sheets of water dragging over the windows and turning the yard into a moving painting. The shadow under the door receded in the noise the way a stain recedes into a sponge, not gone, only somewhere else. I kept my back against the wood until my spine hurt enough to feel like my body again. It was 2:17 when the cicadas started up. They didn't slide in. They returned like a stadium light flipped on, all at once, and everywhere, a scream disguised as nature. The first 5 seconds of their song made me nauseous with relief. The shadow outside withdrew with a last reluctant curl, and the house, my brave, crooked, ordinary house, took a breath that felt shared. I stood up too fast and had to sit again while my brain remembered which way was up. My legs tingled where they'd fallen asleep. My shoulder left a damp patch on the door like I'd sweated through wood. When I finally stood without tipping, I went room to room and touched each covered mirror with 2 fingers, a priest with his icons. I checked the deadbolt, the chain, the little slide lock I'd installed at 10 in the morning that had seemed paranoid then and stupid now because what I'd kept out didn't need locks. At the front door, just above the threshold, the wood was darker. I crouched and ran a fingertip along it. It felt slightly raised, like the grain had swelled, and a smell rose off it, faintly metallic and faintly sweet, like old coins held in the mouth. If I'd had sandpaper, I would have taken the layer off. Instead, I pressed my thumb over it and whispered, "No." Something shifted beyond the door. Not a body, The pressure. I stepped back fast. Dawn came slowly, like someone drawing a knife along the night's stomach to let the light out. It was ugly gray. It was perfect. When I finally opened the front door at 6:11, the air hit me cold and clean. The storm had taken the heat out of everything. The porch steps were slick. A line of water still fell from the gutter in a steady drip that sounded like counting. There were prints on the top step. Not feet, not paws. Ovals. 4 of them. Staggered, as if something with a hand like a starfish had braced itself and then pushed off. Each print was dry in the center and wet at the edges, as if water had avoided the shape while the rest of the world got rained on. Across the street, Sheriff Mathers stood with a paper cup, watching me like a night guard on break. He didn't wave. He didn't frown. He tapped 2 fingers against the brim of the hat he wasn't wearing, a gesture as old as the town's first morning. "How many knocks?" he asked. "Too many," I said. It used her voice. "Whose?" "My mother's." He nodded like he'd been expecting the answer I'd pick. "They'll use whatever you stored badly." "That's not an insult," he added, because it landed like one. "Most of us store badly. We keep the worst parts sharp and the best parts soft. They like the soft parts." I looked at the prints. He followed my eyes and didn't pretend not to see. "It'll leave less if you don't stare," he said. "Rule adjacent." I didn't answer, I told him. A child to a teacher. "Good," he said. "Some folks open a little without opening. Who is it?" "Counts. The door doesn't measure degrees." He sipped coffee that must have tasted like old wood. "Who knocked on yours last week?" I blinked. "I didn't tell you someone knocked last week." "You didn't have to," he said. "You're upright. The knocks don't waste themselves on folks who've never heard them. You'd have opened if your first time had been last night." "I wouldn't." He smiled without humor. "You would. First time's too clean. Second time's where the rule becomes more than a sentence." He finished his coffee and crumpled the cup and put it in his pocket. "Cover your reflections during the day for a while," he said. "Makes them impatient. Impatience makes them sloppy." "What happens if they get in?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at Danny's house, which looked the way a locked jaw looks. "You already know one thing they do," he said. "And the other things?" He shook his head once. "It's Thursday, meeting at 7. He left then, walking down the block at a pace that didn't belong to this century. He paused at the lamppost, not to look, just to feel, then kept going. I sat on the step until the cicadas were ridiculous again. Then I swept water off the boards with a broom and watched the prints become nothing. I told myself the raised grain on the threshold was just swelling. I told myself I hadn't heard the closet breathe. I told myself things people tell themselves when they still want to live in a place. Back inside, I made another list because lists make walls. Buy more tape, find thicker cloth, move the dresser to block the bedroom door from the inside at night, get salt for the thresholds because Mrs. Keene swears by it, even if the sheriff rolls his eyes. Ask the librarian if the town ever tried Bell's sound, fighting sound. At noon, when the sun made the covered mirrors look like swallowed windows, I tugged at the cloth on the hallway one to smooth a wrinkle and stopped when something on the other side tugged back. I left it alone. That night, when 11:50 came and the cicadas stuttered on a beat they hadn't missed all day, I sat down in my place with my back to the bedroom door and my hand on the covered hand mirror like a talisman. The house settled around me. The rules sat down too. At 12:03, the knocking started again. It used the voice of a friend this time, a voice I'd tried to forget for a decade and hadn't. I let it talk, and I let the rule do the answering. In between the knocks, I could hear Hollow Creek breathing, not calm, not panicked, just steady, like a town that knew the shape of night and was willing to hold it until morning came to take it. When dawn finally pried us apart, I got up and made coffee with hands that shook only a little. I looked out at the lamppost and looked away before the darkness there could look back. I whispered the rules one more time to the clean air, and they sounded like instructions for building a boat in a flood. Small, clear, exactly enough to keep your head above water if you don't get clever. I had not answered. I had not broken the door between us. I was still here. For now, by the 6th day, sleep had turned into a trick Hollow Creek played on me. It dangled rest like bait, then yanked it away with a knock, or a creak, or a silence too sharp to ignore. I dozed in crooked bursts on the couch, waking each time the cicadas faltered. One afternoon, heavy-eyed and hollow, I found myself outside the library. The building had been old when I was a child, red brick patched with mismatched mortar, windows clouded from years of damp. A carved plaque by the door read, "Founded 1893, though the way the bricks bowed made me think the date should have been earlier. Inside, it smelled of paper and mildew. The fluorescent lights hummed like insects, a faint chorus above the stacks. And behind the main desk sat Mrs. Heron, the librarian who seemed older than time when I was 10. She looked exactly the same now, only thinner, bones showing sharper beneath her skin. "You're back," she said, not looking up from the book she was stamping. Her voice was dry as paper. "For a while," I said. "I needed something to read." Her eyes watery blue, pale as sky lifted to mine. "Reading won't help you. Listening will." She leaned closer. "You've heard them stop, haven't you?" I nodded. "The cicadas." She shut the book with a thud. "Rule 5. Never enter the woods when the cicadas are silent." She spoke it like scripture, the way the sheriff had, but softer, more like a memory. "Do you know why?" I shook my head. Her mouth trembled not with fear, but with the weight of carrying something for too long. "Because when the chorus stops, the woods are no longer empty. This land was never ours. The people who came before tried to warn us. Their stories said that sound kept the dark things fed. Cicadas are the only wall. When they fall quiet, it means the dark is hungry and moving." Her hands, frail but steady, slid across the counter. She pushed a folder toward me. Newspaper clippings, brittle and yellow, slipped out. Each one told the same story, though the names changed. Child missing near creek. Hunter lost in woods. Search party finds no trace. Each article mentioned the same detail. The woods were unusually quiet. My stomach nodded. "So, the cicadas protect us?" "They distract it," she whispered. "It feeds on silence. It hunts in silence. If you step into stillness, you step into its mouth." I left the library with the folder under my arm, though I wasn't sure she'd meant me to take it. That evening, restless, I walked near the tree line at the edge of town. The air was thick with cicada song, a sound so constant I'd almost learned to tune it out. It buzzed in my skull, vibrating teeth and nerves. And then, without warning, it stopped. Not faded, stopped. The world froze. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I felt the silence like a pressure, pressing against my eardrums until they ached. My lungs begged me to run, but my legs locked. In that awful stillness, I heard something else. A crack. A branch bending under weight. Then another. I stared into the trees. The shadows between trunks shifted not with wind, not with light, but with movement too large, too deliberate. Something vast crawled there, moving with the sound of many limbs dragging against bark. I couldn't see it clearly, but its outline filled the gaps between trees like black water spilling into cracks. I stepped back, slowly, one step, then another. My breath made too much sound, ragged and loud in my throat. The silence held. The branches groaned, and for a terrible moment, I thought the shadows turned toward me like a face without shape, recognizing prey. Then the cicadas screamed back to life. The forest shivered, as if something immense had slipped away. Sound returned all at once, thick and suffocating, but safe. I staggered back to the road, heart hammering, sweat chilling on my skin. I didn't need Mrs. Heron's folder to tell me anymore. The rules weren't warnings, they were instructions. And if the cicadas ever fell silent while I stood among the trees, I wouldn't be walking back out. The town insisted on pretending we were normal at least once a year. They chose early autumn for it, after the first cool night but before the frost, when apples still snapped like glass under your teeth and the maples around Hollow Creek wore colors so bright they looked painted on. The harvest festival had always been the same. Hay bales for seeding, a pie contest with more rules than our sheriff, and kids running with paper lanterns shaped like moons. When I was little, I loved the festival because for a few hours everyone came out of their houses at once. It made the town look bigger. This year, the same booths lined the square, the same yellow bulbs strung from eaves, the same lopsided banner, Hollow Creek Harvest Night. Someone had added, in smaller letters, "Ends at 9:17. No one joked about the addendum. By noon, the square smelled like cinnamon and fryer oil and cut hay. A bluegrass trio squeezed their instruments under the gazebo where the preacher usually lectured the pigeons. People lingered in little circles, talking with their eyes on the sun like campers watching a campfire burn down. The curfew sat in every conversation like an extra, quiet person. It kept time for us. I helped Mrs. Keene carry trays of cider donuts to her table. She shook her head at me, but not like before. The motion was gentler now, like I'd done one or two things right. When I set the last tray down, she pressed a little paper ticket into my palm. "For the raffle," she said. "What's the prize?" "An extra lock," she said dryly, and moved on. Children tore by with paper moons on strings, the moons turning and flashing foil in the sun. A little boy held his up to his face like a mask and shouted boo at a dog. The dog pretended to be fooled. For a while, the music and the smell of grilled corn and the normal clatter of forks against cheap plates made the rules feel like a rumor. I stood near the edge of the square with my back to the street so I wouldn't have to see the lamppost at the end of Main. Parents drifted by in pairs, trading whispers and taking turns pretending not to count. The clock on the courthouse read 7:42. The air had that thin bite that tells you the day has an exit plan. I ate something called a harvest hand pie without tasting it, and tried not to look at the sky's color as it softened. Sheriff Mathers made a loop every 15 minutes. He didn't carry a gun. He did carry a folded sheet of paper, and even from 20 feet, I didn't have to guess what was printed on it. He stopped beside the gazebo at 8:31 and lifted a finger, and the music put its tune down like a child instructed to set the toy away. He spoke into a small battery mic that made his voice sound like a radio left on in a garage. "Enjoy yourselves," he said. "Stay together. Mind the time. You know the rest." Which was the same as reading the rules aloud without reading them. Parents drew their kids closer by slow degrees. Teenagers who'd been leaning on each other in the shadows laughed a little too loud and moved where there were more eyes. The trio started again, softer. A song I almost recognized from when my mother hummed while she set bread in the oven. At 8:47, someone lit the paper lanterns. They floated like small captive moons over the square. The children squealed. A girl pushed a lantern up with her palm and then jerked her hand away when heat licked her skin. Her father hit a flinch. He was already calculating the walk home, the house, the locks. I tried to let the warm light rewire my head. This was why we kept these rituals, because they rebuilt the day over the bones of night. But the more the festival tried to be bright, the more the edges of it looked like theater scenery nailed onto something darker. The watchman appeared without anyone announcing him. I didn't see him walk in. He was simply there, at the far end of the row of booths, where the square narrowed toward Main. Long brown coat, cuffs worn, hat brim low. He didn't browse. He didn't eat. He didn't talk. He stood with his hands at his sides like a sentinel whose orders were simple and whose failure would cost too much. Rule 6 tugged at my throat. Always greet the watchman if you see him. I didn't wait. I moved through the crowd until I came within the little clearing that people somehow gave him without noticing they were giving it. I kept my eyes on the buttons of his coat because looking directly into his too pale gaze always made my skin feel a size too small. "Evening," I said. His jaw shifted like I'd relieved a pain he'd been holding like a coin behind his teeth. "Evening," he said, and the word came out dry, papery, as if the syllables had traveled a long distance without water. "You're learning." "I'm trying." "That's all we get," he said. "Trying." Up close, I could see dark stains on the cuff of his coat. Not fresh, not old either. The kind of marks that come from brushing against something that rubs off on you even if you don't let it in. I wanted to ask him 100 questions, the big ones, the child's ones, but you don't ask a fire why it burns. You accept its terms or you don't. I nodded instead. He tipped his head toward the square. "When she says to go home," he said quietly, "you go." "Who?" I asked, then saw her Mrs. Heron, the librarian, standing near the gazebo with a small brass bell in her hand. I'd never seen the bell before. It made a tight ache form behind my eyes, like I'd been waiting all my life for a sound I hadn't known to expect. "She counts," he said. "We don't watch the clock exactly. We watch her hand." I smelled cold in the air then, the kind that comes not from temperature but from attention. People nearer the courthouse steps rubbed their arms. 2 teenage boys laughed, and then stopped mid-laugh, surprised by their own mouths. At 9:09, the watchman's head twitched toward Main without his body moving. He didn't look at the lamppost. He never looked directly. He sensed the way migrating birds sense a magnetic field. "Your steps," he said to me. "Make sure you count them." "I know the way home," I said. "Do you?" His mouth made a shape that might have been a smile and might have been a grimace at the same thought. It's been known to change when you need it most. Mrs. Heron lifted the brass bell at 9:13 and rang it once. The sound wasn't loud. It was sharp and bright and perfect, the note of a glass struck by a fork in a kitchen you trust. Heads turned. 100 little conversations ended mid-consonant. The trio stopped. The children with the moon lanterns stared up at the sky like the bell had rung in their chests. She rang it again at 9:15. The watchman's hand twitched. Around the square, people began to extinguish things. Stove flames, lantern wicks, cigarettes. It was like watching a tide pull out of a harbor light sucked away into pockets and jars to be carried home. At 9:16, the sheriff lifted his mic. "We're done," he said. "Go." There was no panic. There was efficiency. Stalls shut in practiced motions. The paper moons bobbed lower as parents reeled them in like fish. The square, so recently warm with people, turned into a place built of angles and departures. I should have left then. My house was 9 minutes' walk if I cut behind the feed store and didn't look where I shouldn't. 9 minutes meant a narrow victory. 9 minutes meant running only the last block and making it look like I'd planned to do that anyway. I told myself to go, and my feet agreed, and then someone said my name. Hey. Danny's neighbor, the one who had sobbed herself empty in his living room, stood beside the raffle table, her hands full of tickets, and her mouth set like she was chewing on guilt. "Can you help me carry this box to my truck?" she asked. "Please." My hands. She lifted them. They trembled as if from too much coffee, or too much never sleeping. I looked toward Maine, then back at her. The watchman hadn't moved. He didn't interfere. That was not his job. He watched. 2 minutes, I told myself. And that was the mistake, because time in Hollow Creek doesn't care what you call it. We carried the box between us, weaving through the tail of the crowd. The sky was the color of steel wool. My skin fizzed with the sense that light had already tightened into strings tied to the edges of things. I could still make it, I told myself. The bell would ring a third time, and the note would be like a hand at my back, and I would. Something fell. A paper lantern slipped from someone's fingers and drifted up on the little heat engine of its own fire. Higher than it should, then higher still, until it bumped the string of yellow bulbs and burst with a soft pop like a moth hitting a windshield. Tiny ash flakes drifted down. The children squealed. For 3 seconds, everyone looked up. I looked up too. Then I looked at the clock. Joden Shatifan. I didn't let myself look at 9:18 when it slid in like a shadow taking another step. The box hit the truck bed with a clatter just as the bell rang. It wasn't the soft, precise note from before. It was a desperate sting, sharp and a touch too loud, like the hand ringing it had shaken. The sound blitzed the square with urgency that felt like the first beat of running. People moved faster. Doors slammed. The sheriff pointed with the sheet of rules held high like a flag. "Home," he barked. Now. I ran. Not pretty running. The kind you do when your body remembers falling and would like not to repeat it. I cut behind the feed store and took the alley behind the barber shop. The alley already smelled cold, the dumpsters and damp brick compressing the air into something nervous. A cat yowled, that long, hollow sound cats make when they meet things that aren't here in daylight. When I reached the mouth of the alley, I could see Maine. It looked too long. The lamppost at the far end of the block burned its pale cone. The halo of its light was smaller than it had been at dusk. The air around it wavered like heat without heat. I told myself, don't look directly. I told myself without words, just with the small animal in me that had learned. I kept my eyes level with the empty storefront's dark glass and moved. A figure stood under the lamppost. He had always stood there. That was the point. He was a fixed fact, the way a cliff is a fact. What moved was me, the town, the planet. I kept my gaze off-center and quick. I counted steps under my breath. 1, 2, 3 counting made the distance tame. By step 8, the figure tilted its head. It didn't tilt like a person checking their shoulder. It tilted like a stack of books tipping past the angle where gravity tolerates stacks. Bones don't bend into that angle. The neck was a suggestion, not a structure. The light on the sidewalk ran toward him and then seemed to unspool before it reached his shoes, like thread meeting oil. I didn't look. My eyes tried to hook on shadows the way burrs hook on fabric. I kept them moving over shop signs I could read by heart from 30 years ago. Finkel's shoes, Gilroy's tackle, Mabel's. The windows gave me my own blurred shape walking, and if another shape moved with mine, a hair too tall and a hair too near, I ignored it, like ignoring could cancel anything. Don't, a voice said softly near my left ear. Not my mother, not anyone, not air, either. Just the sound of something learning how to be a whisper and doing it well enough to pass at night. I didn't change pace. If I ran now, I would sprint like prey, and prey running triggers mouths to open. I moved, like someone going home on time. The lamppost man's head tilted further. The angle made my stomach revolt. The small pain in my neck, old car wreck, old whiplash flashed white-hot like a mirror remembering who it was. My vision pulsed. For an instant, I saw a different posture. Not head tilted, but the world tilted around a head that stayed straight, a fixed point, and everything else bent. A door slammed somewhere. A lock slid. A second lock. People were inside now. Maine had turned into a hallway. I'd been left to cross alone. Don't look, I told myself, and then I did. A thief's glance, quick, treacherous. What I saw was absence. Not a man, not a coat, not a face. A cutout of night, darker than the rest of night. The way a hole in fabric looks blacker than the room it opens into. The outline had shoulders and hands. The hands were too long. They hung too straight, like a puppet whose strings were all pulled at once and then released. The glance was enough. It hooked my eyes like a fishhook. Every cell in my body tried to correct the mistake by looking harder. That is how we work with anything that frightens us. We take a second bite at the apple to prove the first bite didn't change us. The second bite is always worse. Footsteps rushed behind me. They weren't mine. They weren't shoes, either. They were like someone walking on their fingers fast. The tap-tap-tap of many small hard tips on concrete, closing. A hand closed on my arm. Human. Strong. I swung with my free elbow and then stopped because the pain I caused answered me with a grunt I recognized. Inside. The watchman hissed. He didn't drag me so much as pivot me, turning the whole me as if I'd become a sign on a hinge and he'd found the right angle. He spun me through the barbershop door with a push that felt like it had to happen in exactly that second or it wouldn't happen at all. The bell over the door made a choked sound that tried to be cheerful and failed. The watchman shoved the deadbolt with the side of his fist. He pressed his back to the wood. For a second we stood like that, two people holding a door against an ocean. Then a weight leaned, just enough to bow the wood a millimeter, then ease off as if testing strengths. "Don't look at it," he said softly. He didn't raise his head. He stared at the floor between his boots. His breath clicked at the top of his throat like paper. "I didn't," I said, and then managed honesty. "I did, a little." "Don't," he repeated. "You won't get a second chance at that." Outside, the lamppost hummed. The sound raised the hair on my arms one by one. The little bell over the barber's door settled into a silence that meant it was listening. We didn't talk for a long minute. The watchman's hand trembled where it braced the door. I realized then that under the coat and the hat and the two pale eyes was a body that got tired like mine. I wanted to ask him if he had a house, if he slept, if anyone greeted him when he needed it. He moved first. He stepped away from the door, keeping his gaze on the corner where the floor met the wall. "He's not for you tonight," he said. "He wanted to check the weight of your attention. He'll try again, at some other edge." "At Tesha Sheva Sarah?" I asked. "When he likes," the watchman said. "We gave him a schedule. He takes it as a courtesy, not a law." He reached into the pocket of his coat and took out a strip of dark cloth. He held it out. "Sleep with this around your head," he said, "just above the ears. It will not keep you safe, but you'll wake faster when you need to." "What is it?" "Old," he said. "Old enough to remember why rules are easier than reasons." I took it. The fabric felt soft the way expensive things are soft, and rough the way handmade things are rough, like it had been woven on a loom that also told stories. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Do as you're told." I opened my mouth to ask a kinder question, and he stopped me with one raised finger. "Listen," he said. We both did. Outside, the humming settled. The pressure eased. Far away, a child cried once and was silenced quickly, not by force, but by a parent's hand over a mouth and a quiet shh into hair. "Go home," he said. "The night is more awake when you're awake with it." "Will you?" I started. "Will you walk with me?" He tilted his head, not like the lamppost man, but like a person hearing something behind a wall. "No," he said. "That's not my work." He paused, and for the first time I saw something like warmth in him, the glow of a coal that hadn't quite gone out. "But I will stand where I stand." He unlocked the door and opened it a slit. He didn't look. He felt his way into the street with his senses I couldn't name. Then he nodded once, either to me or to whatever had been out there, and I slipped past him and kept my gaze on the safe, indecisive thing of my own shadow on the sidewalk. I made it home in 38 steps that felt like the longest 38 of my life. I shut the door and leaned my head against it and counted my teeth with my tongue because I needed to be sure the number hadn't changed. That night I dreamt. I don't often remember dreams. Hollow Creek wrings them out of you by dawn. But I remember this one. The lamppost man stood beside my bed, closer than a bedside lamp. He didn't bend his neck this time. He bent mine, not with hands, with idea. He tilted me toward the ceiling until my ear faced him, and he spoke into it. He didn't speak words. He spoke pressure, a dense coil of sound that forced its way into the drum, and then pushed, steady, steady, until my body forgot there were bones guarding the brain. I woke with the taste of iron, and my pillow blooming with a stain. Blood tickled a path into my ear. The room swam. I sat up too fast, and the floor tilted like a boat. The strip of cloth the watchman had given me lay on the quilt like a question I'd forgotten to answer. My hands shook while I tied it around my head, low and snug, covering the tender place behind the ear where children learn their balance. The fabric warmed with my skin. The pressure behind my ear eased in the smallest degree, as if the cloth knew how to redistribute pain the way a good hand knows how to redistribute weight. I went to the mirror in the hallway and reached for the tape, holding the sheet in place on one corner. Habit. Stupid, disaster habit. I stopped myself an inch away and let my hand hang there, 2 fingers cocked like a pistol I would never fire. On the other side of the cloth, something waited with the same patience I had used at the door for the knocking. It wasn't moving. It was ready. Not tonight, I said. Not ever, if I can help it. In the morning, I found the watchman's cloth had a wet mark where it had covered my ear. Not blood, not water. Something that dried without leaving a stain and left a whisper behind it, like a word that refused to translate. I washed the cloth and it darkened the basin a shade and then cleared again. I wore it the next night, and the next, and it's possible the cloth did nothing more than remind my body to choose waking over sleep when it needed to. But reminders are rules, and rules are the only way to make a night like ours into something a person can move through without being rewritten. At the Thursday meeting, Sheriff Mathers read the 6 lines again. People mouthed them with him. His eyes found mine over the paper once, and he did not smile. The watchman stood in the back like the shadow of the rules made into a man, and when I left I nodded. He didn't nod back. I didn't need him to. The greeting is the lock. The response is only the click you listen for, because you are human. I walked home under a sky so clear the stars looked like holes punched in a black drum, and I did not look at the lamppost. I counted my steps, not because I believed counting controls anything, but because numbers fill silence with shapes, and sometimes that's enough for a night to pass without learning your name. I started writing the rules on scraps of paper and leaving them around the house like traps for my own mind. Above the sink, on the back of the front door, taped inside the cabinet with the coffee. I copied them in a child's block print, simple and blunt, as if extra syllables gave the dark more to grip. Then I began making small notes, underneath each one, observations, times, the feel of the air when the cicadas cut out, the exact second the lamppost hummed, whether the knocking came in 3s or 4s. It wasn't courage. It was a new obsession. If I understood the pattern, I could predict it. If I could predict it, I could survive it, without living like a trapped animal. Patterns are seductive. They imitate safety. Thursday's meeting ended early. The sheriff's voice had a rasp in it, and the bell in Mrs. Heron's hand rang 1 step sharp, like metal, with a hairline crack. On my walk home, I realized I'd started counting steps without meaning to. 38 from the church to Mabel's, 22 from Mabel's to the alley, 12 to my door if I didn't look anywhere I shouldn't. I unlocked, stepped inside, locked again. I put my notes on the table and added the day's entry beneath. Rule 1. Curfew holds if bell rings. Curfew bends if bell falters. It looked like a real sentence sitting there, tired and certain. It calmed me. For 3 nights after that, nothing new happened. I slept in shallow bowls of time. The knocking came on schedule and left when it was bored not being answered. The cicadas performed their trick loud, off, loud again with enough regularity that I learned to feel the instant before they stopped. Like astronomy you sense in your teeth. I greeted the watchman when I saw him once outside the post office. Once under the elm where the high school used to be, and each time I felt a click inside me, a door sealing. The town breathed. I breathed with it. On the fourth night, a stranger came through. We don't get many. We pretend we're on a road that leads somewhere and so people might pass, but you have to want to turn down into Hollow Creek. You don't end up here by accident, unless the accident is that something else decided your route. He wore a backpack and a city jacket, dark and clean and wrong for our streets. He had a beard that tried to make him look older and eyes that made him look younger, wide and interested, the way people look at abandoned places online. He bought a coffee from Mabel's and left his cash on the counter like a tip for a photograph he was taking with his brain. He read the flyer on the community board and took a picture of it with his phone. I watched from across the street with a sickness that felt like guilt. He didn't mean harm. That made it worse. He walked past the lamppost at 5 in the afternoon and turned to look directly at it because he wanted to see what the fuss was. The lamppost looked like a lamppost. He laughed alone, a single puff of sound. He asked the sheriff for directions to the trailhead and took offense when the sheriff said, "Don't." At 9:13, the bell rang once. The stranger kept his headphones in and didn't look. At 9:15, the bell rang again. He took a picture of the lanterns and posted it. I know because I saw his screen flash. At 9:16, I stood 2 storefronts away and tried to meet his eyes without getting involved in a story I knew would end with a board nailed across something. At 9:17, the square dissolved as it always did. People peeled into doors, into cars, into the hollows between buildings, where we pretend not to count. The stranger stayed. He was curious and a little clumsy, and the exact kind of person the rules are written for, because they try to make curiosity cost nothing. He broke Rule 1 in the neatest, cleanest way. He was outside at 9:18 wearing a grin like he was about to be charmed. Nothing happened. Not then. He strolled. He filmed the quiet street. He said, "Spooky," into his camera. He pointed it at the lamppost, and the cone of light looked like it always did on video, weak and honest. He called out, "Is this your guy?" and did a little turn, smiling at his own bit. He went to sleep at the motel on the hill. He had a room with 2 beds and a patterned quilt and a mirror bolted to the dresser, the way all motels bolt mirrors to reassure you about something. He didn't cover it. He posted the rules list with a joke about small-town urban legends and fell asleep to television noise. No one disappeared that night. In the morning, the stranger came down to the diner like he'd beaten a dare. He told Mabel our rules were a vibe, which made her smile the way people do when a child learns to tie their shoes wrong. He walked the square. People watched him with their eyes and kept their mouths shut. Sheriff Mathers watched him with his mouth and kept his eyes shut. The watchman watched him the way a weather vane watches wind. I added a note under Rule 1, no instant consequence. It made me bold enough to write the rest. Punishment is delayed. I drew an arrow to the margin and wrote in smaller letters, an admission. This is worse. The stranger started being followed, not by the sheriff, not by me, by attention. He would stop to tie his shoe and his reflection in dark glass would be a half-beat late, interested in something over his shoulder. He would fix his hair, and the image in the barber's window would lift a hand with a curious, slow grace, as if testing a new muscle. He walked past the lamppost in daylight, and the humming, which never starts before dusk, began low, almost too low to hear, but enough to make his face crease with an itch he could not place. He broke Rule 2 at noon, turning to look directly into the lamppost's light, and squinting like it offended him. Nothing happened then either, unless you count the way his shadow didn't sit exactly where it should after that. It slipped a little when he turned, like a coat grasped by a hand he couldn't feel. He broke Rule 3 with a laugh. When the motel door knocked at 12:06 the next night, 3 little knuckles against cheap wood, he said, "Who is it?" through a mouthful of crackers. It counts. The door doesn't measure degrees. You either answer or you do not. After that, he slept with the television on, because he wanted noise without having to think about why. He didn't cover his mirror. He didn't greet the watchman. He didn't go near the woods, not because of Rule 5, but because he wasn't that kind of tourist. By the 3rd day, faces in town turned away when he walked by, as if sparing him attention was a kindness we could still afford. Danny's neighbor crossed herself behind her grocery bag. I wanted to tell the stranger, "Leave now. You can still leave," but saying it would have made it true, and truth is a door too. The pressure built around him like weather. He started talking to himself, not muttering. Conversations, At the crosswalk, he said, "Yeah?" To no one. To someone. To an arrangement of air that pressed back. He laughed at a joke, whispered by a mouth behind a wall. He put his headphones in and listened to nothing. The wire ran into his pocket, not a phone. At 9:10 on the fourth night, I saw him stand in the empty square and take off his backpack like he was ready for a camera crew to appear. He stretched his arms out, so the low light caught the hairs, and said to no one, "Okay, show me." The watchman was 30 feet away. I was closer. I could have walked the 3 steps to the stranger and said his name if I'd known it. I did not. I watched as the town we live in began to teach him the word stalked. The lamppost man didn't appear. That would have been kindness. What came instead was the knocking, not at his door this time, but behind him in the glass of the barber's, then again in the window of the hardware store, then again in the vending machine outside the laundromat. Small, polite taps, like a child playing tag at the edge of your vision. The stranger laughed and spun and videoed himself, spinning, and the comments on his live stream filled with people saying, "Chill bro," and "Fake," and "Lol Hollow Creek Challenge." He went back to his room that night and slept on top of the covers with his shoes on the way drunks do. Except he wasn't drunk, he was being worn down by the kind of attention a predator uses when it wants prey to choose. I wrote under Rule 3, they escalate when you give them half of what they want. I added a line beneath Rule 4, uncovered mirrors equals faster stalking. I wrote packed with a question mark beside Rule 6 and underlined it twice. Always greet the watchman if you see him. Why always? Why greet? Why wasn't notice enough? I found out. I'd stayed up late scratching at my notes with a dull pencil, chasing my tail through hypotheses that felt clever at 2 a.m. and brittle at 3. I slept finally, cheek pressed to the page, and woke to sunlight and the echo of my own hunger. I opened the door, barefoot, to get the paper like people used to, because ritual makes the mornings look civilized. The watchman stood at the edge of my walkway. He hadn't come to the door. He never would. He stood where his work asked him to stand. I blinked at him and smiled, and the morning was so ordinary that for the first time since I returned, I felt that I could simply lift my hand and walk past a rule because I wanted to. I didn't greet him, not for any reason, not out of defiance, out of the laziness that follows nights without good sleep. I moved past him to the sidewalk, with my mind still in the room. He didn't move. He didn't clear his throat or tilt his head. He stood as the sun rimmed his hat and his coat's cuffs like tarnished brass. I glanced at his face and looked away, because even in daylight those eyes prodded old instincts I didn't want to name. I went back inside with the paper under my arm and shut the door. That was all. The house noticed first. Always greet the watchman if you see him. We said them slow. We said them like we were adding our breath to a scarf around the town's throat. When we filed out, the watchman waited at the door. He met each person's eyes, and each person greeted him. Some people bowed their heads as if he were a priest. He did not bless us. He took the greetings like coins he didn't want and put them in a pocket with a hole. "Will you hold?" I asked when it was my turn. The question shamed me even as I said it. "When the rules break," he said again, "so do we." He paused and his voice softened, like cloth after you've slept on it. "But breaking isn't the same as leaving." "What is it?" A draft pushed under the kitchen door when no window was open. The smell changed. It went sour-sweet, like apples left too long on a windowsill. The refrigerator motor clicked on and then stayed on, a steady whir that refused to cycle down. I thought, power company. And then my skin tightened an inch because I had learned to stop offering normal names as bribes. In the hall, the cloth over the mirror lifted a quarter inch and fell. No breeze, no footsteps, just the slow, deliberate rise of something taking a breath wherever breath is possible. "Ungreeted," a whisper said from right above the doorframe where old transoms used to vent heat in July. "Unprotected." The word didn't arrive through my ears. It arrived under my skin, just above the heart, like a hand flattening itself there, before pushing very gently, testing strength the way a dentist tests a tooth. I stood very still. The voice, no, not a voice. A verdict said it again. Ungreeted, unprotected. The house agreed. The locks felt different under my hand, thinner, as if what they had been holding back had slid its attention to me because I had failed my end of a bargain I hadn't written. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch too fast, embarrassed by my fear like it was a superstition rather than a mechanism. The watchman hadn't moved. He looked not at me but at a spot 3 inches to the right of my shoulder. as if focusing directly on me would give me to something else by accident. "Evening," I said, at 9 in the morning. My throat rasped. "Evening." He didn't answer immediately. His jaw worked, once, then, "Evening." The word fell between us like a coin pushed back across a counter. The pressure on my chest eased a degree. The refrigerator motor cut out. The cloth over the mirror settled. "It matters," he said. "I know," I said, shame warm on my neck. "You didn't," he said, and there was no cruelty in it. "But you will." He turned, then, not just his head, but the whole of him, like a compass needle seeking its magnetic home. He walked away without looking at the lamppost because he never does, and the birds in the maple fought over something loud and small and alive, and made it a story I could hold. I went inside and wrote under Rule 6 in my block print, "Always." I doubled the line under it until the paper threatened to tear. Beside it I wrote, "The greeting is not for him," and circled it. I didn't know who it was for exactly. Maybe for the story we live inside. Maybe for the town itself, like a password exchanged between patient captives. The stranger didn't greet him that day either. He saw the watchman outside the motel and smirked and kept walking. And I understood then what real fear is. Not when things come for you, but when they come for someone who hasn't learned yet, and you are not allowed to stand between. That evening, I followed at a distance, pretending I wasn't. The stranger filmed as he walked, his wide-eyed face small in the corner of the screen, while the town stretched behind him like a set. He stopped beneath the motel's ice machine and narrated the way it clunked. He waved at the camera and said he was doing a night challenge. At 9:17, he stood in the center of Maine on purpose. He lifted his arms like a ref calling a play. I stood in a doorway where I could look without looking. At 9:20, the knocking started again. Not at doors, but on the glass around him. Barber, hardware, laundromat, my own front window, synchronizing like a metronome, secretly guiding dancers. He reeled with delight and fear. It's a high some people like proof that something beyond boredom wants your attention. At 10:02, he stood under the lamppost and said, "Hey buddy," and tipped an imaginary hat. Nothing tilted, nothing moved. At 10:07, his phone died. Batteries die here when attention wants you more than you want yourself. At 10:19, he began to jog, not because anything chased him that he could name, but because jogging is a way to be prey without admitting you're prey. The lamppost hummed for the first time that late. The shadow under its cone lengthened the wrong way. At 10:26, he reached the motel door and yanked the handle like he'd forgotten he needed a key. The knocking answered from inside his room by knocking on the window on the second floor. He stopped gripping the handle then, because something in him understood degrees. He backed away. He didn't run. He went on tiptoe, which made me want to cry because he was trying not to wake what was already awake. He made it to my block at 10:33. He stopped in front of my porch, eyes blown wide, breath sharp. "Hey," he whispered, and I didn't answer, because Rule 3 has taught me that whispering through doors counts. He swallowed something like pride and said in a voice just loud enough for me to hear, "Please." The lamppost hummed higher, pleased. The shadow at the end of the street leaned. I pressed my hand to the door and listened. The stranger took one step backward, then reached into his pocket for his dead phone like the shape of it could do what the power in it could not. The knocking traveled tap-tap at my window, tap-tap at the mailbox, tap-tap at the metal lid of the trash can, and the sound around him made a sphere that had him at the center. He didn't break again. He didn't speak. He remembered a rule he wasn't sure of, and tried to stand still inside it. After 12 long seconds, the knocking stopped. The shadow rolled itself back along the street like someone winding a hose. The cicadas, which had been loud enough to make my teeth ache, cut out for 2 full heartbeats, and I knew the thing in the trees had turned its head and chosen not to come, because hunting is work, and this one wasn't weak enough yet. He exhaled a laugh that hurt my stomach to hear. Relief without understanding is a trap with an extra spring. For 2 more days, the town punished him in small ways for every rule he had insulted. The mirrors where he stood were late with him. His steps took him nowhere twice. He asked for directions to the highway, and every person told him the right way, and he took it and found himself beside the same creek with the same dented stop sign, the loop closing while the sun moved, which is its own cruelty. I drew a box on my paper and wrote, "Rules equals pact." Underneath, I listed the parts I thought I knew. We do X, greet, cover, ignore, leave. They delay why, devour, inhabit, rewrite, breach gleich permission, delay différent de merci. I looked at those sentences until my head was hot with certainty. I forgot the rule about not getting clever. On the third morning, I went looking for the watchman. That's not what you do. You greet him when you see him because he is where he needs to be, not where you need him to be. But I stalked the square, the church steps, the elm, the post office, all the little nodes where the town's nervous system meets skin. I wanted to ask for a new rule, a seventh that would feel like a key. I found him beside the lamppost at noon, which I had never seen before. He stood in the lamplight's weak cone as if it were shade. His coat cuffs showed new dark stains. "What is it?" I asked, without greeting first, and then corrected myself, throat tight. "Evening." His eyes slid to mine and away before they did damage. "Evening." "The stranger," I said. "He's being punished. They're practicing on him. Can we—" I didn't have an end to the sentence that stayed inside possible. "Can we give him back?" The watchman's jaw flexed once. He broke without accepting. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. He looked past my shoulder at a place where nothing was. "You're writing them down," he said. "Yes." "Be careful," he said. "Names make things easier to summon. Patterns do too." "I'm not summoning," I said. "I'm surviving." "Those are close." I wanted to argue. I wanted to show him my papers and have him circle lines and say, "Good, this one," like a teacher with a red pen and a student with a need. Instead, I heard again the whisper that had filled my house. Ungreeted, unprotected. I swallowed it with the rest. That night, I forgot to greet him again. It was not laziness this time. It was a spill. He stood at the corner while I wrangled a bag of salt from the trunk for the thresholds, because I'd decided salt belongs wherever a rule mentions doors. Mrs. Keene had told me so. The sheriff had not rolled his eyes where I could see. I hoisted the bag onto my hip and walked past him without the word. Maybe he wasn't looking at me. Maybe he was. Maybe I thought if I paid him human attention, he would have to be human. Inside, the whisper came faster. Ungreeted, unprotected. The knocking started before midnight. It tapped at the kitchen clock, at the back of the mirror's cloth with a tick like fingernails on drywall. The cicadas, who should have held the line, faltered. Once, then again. Mirrors shivered behind their covers. The salt at the threshold made a shape like a river delta, where something had pushed from underneath. I grabbed the doorknob and didn't open. I said "evening" to the empty hallway like an apology, and felt the word go out through the walls, and find him, and come back carrying some of what it had taken. The whispers retreated. The house let me breathe air that wasn't borrowed. I added one more note, in a different hand, angry, scared, mine but more jagged. The rules are not suggestions. The rules are a pact. Breaking one writes your name down where you don't want it listed. And still, even with that fresh and underlined, I kept chasing my pattern. On the 5th day, after the stranger arrived, I drew timelines on butcher paper and ran red thread between 9, 17, lamppost, hum, mirror, lag, knocking schedule. It looked like a conspiracy tree. It was. I stood back and considered it, and felt something in the house lean toward the red thread, as if it could follow it back to the heart, and not just the map. The stranger left town that afternoon. He tried at noon, which is the proper time to try if there is one. He took the highway the sheriff pointed him to, and drove until the sun baked his windshield. He filmed himself in the car with a laugh and a half-sob underneath. His live stream cut out 5 minutes past the line where the county sign should have been. At 2:06, he pulled into a turnout to check his dead phone, and when he looked up from his lap, he was parked beside our creek and our dented stop sign and our blue house with boards across the door. He screamed. He screamed not because he was hurt, but because he had learned that the map he trusted had always been someone else's. He banged his hands on the steering wheel and then he pressed his forehead to it and cried in the soft, hopeless way people cry when they know they are still intended to live, at least for now. He is still here. He walks like a person wearing borrowed legs. He drinks coffee from Mabel's with both hands as if heat is a test. He tries the rules on like a coat at a thrift store, and takes them off as soon as no one is looking. They are punishing him without taking him, and that is the worst I have ever seen this town do. Teach. That night, around 11:30, I lay down on the floor on purpose with my ear to the boards. It was a stupid thing. I did it anyway. I wanted to hear if the knocking started in the wood, if the house was a drum and the night a thumb. What I heard was my own heart, and under it a steady little scratch I thought was mice until it spelled a word I didn't want. Count. I got up fast and wrote no more patterns on the page in letters so big they looked like a different alphabet. I tore the red thread down and stuffed it into a drawer. I folded the butcher paper and put it under the sink. I sat with my back to the bedroom door and put my hand on the covered mirror and whispered, "Evening," to the watchman out in the dark. And I swear, the house answered with a long, relieved loosening, like a knot learning how. From then on, I still wrote notes, but I wrote them smaller. I said the rules simpler. I tried to live inside the shape of them without naming the angles. It wasn't surrender. It was a way to stop drawing invitations. But even with the thread hidden and the word packed circled and the salt neat across my doors, I could feel the town shifting under me, just a little, the way a sleeping animal shifts to take weight off a sore side. The rules held. They creaked. Something on the other side of them pressed harder, impatient now with how careful we had been. And somewhere near Maine, the lamppost's hum slid a note up, just enough to itch in the jaw, just enough to tell me the part of the story where rules crack had begun. It started with small betrayals, little slips that could almost pass as weather, or age, or nerves. The kind of cracks you ignore in a wall because the picture still hangs straight. The knocking came at 11:41 instead of after midnight. 3 polite taps on the front door, followed by one at the hallway wall, as if a guest had arrived early and was proud of their punctuality. I sat up fast, already angry, already afraid, already rehearsing the rule in my head like a tune I could not afford to forget. If you hear knocking after midnight, never answer. After midnight. After. The word stuck in my throat like a bone. I held the doorknob and told myself the rule still held, even if time had slipped. I did not answer. The knocks circled once, then faded, satisfied with making the line blurry. The next afternoon, at 2:06, the cicadas stopped. Broad daylight. No clouds moving. No wind. Their sudden silence laid a cold hand over the town. I was carrying salt to Mrs. Keene's porch and I nearly dropped the bag because the world lost its hum the way a plane loses altitude. Far off, in the trees, branches bowed under weight I could not see. The shadow there did not care that the clock was wrong. It moved anyway, hunting by rules I had not been given. I set the salt down and stepped backward onto her porch. The cicadas resumed all at once, the sound snapping on like a switch, and the shadow folded back into the seam between trunks with the lazy certainty of a cat that knows it can come back any time. "Do you hear it?" I asked Mrs. Keene through the door. "I hear everything," she said, and slid the chain without opening. That evening, I checked the sheets on my mirrors and found the cloth, wet, not soaked, not stained, damp, at the center, like something had exhaled against it for a long time. When I smoothed the fabric, the wet circle moved with my hand, following pressure the way water follows a finger on a bowl. I taped the corners tighter and told myself I was sealing a draft. My mouth was dry. At the Thursday meeting, people arrived early and left late because no one wanted to walk home alone through the new timing. The sheriff's voice was hoarse. He read the rules slowly, and once, on Rule 5, his eyes lost the words and then found them again like a man missing a stare in the dark. "Never enter the woods when the cicadas are silent." They were silent at lunch, someone said from the back. "What now?" "We stay out of the woods," he said, and cleared his throat like he could swallow the doubt that had escaped. "What about the knocking?" someone else asked. "Mine started before midnight." The sheriff folded the paper. "We don't change the rules because they do," he said. "We hold them." "Hold them against what?" a man near the aisle said, not loud, not challenging, tired. The watchman stood near the exit. I greeted him. He did not smile this time, not even that small papery relief of a man thanked for something he didn't ask to do. His eyes stayed on the floor. When the meeting ended, he didn't go out into the night first like he usually did. He waited, as if the door had to be tested by other feet. I followed him up into the square. The lanterns were not lit tonight. The banner still hung overhead. Hollow Creek Harvest Night, but the added ends at 9:17 had been torn off by wind or hands. The absence of that line made the sky look bigger and less friendly. "Are they changing them?" I asked him, matching my step to his. "The rules? They don't change anything," he said. "They move. We are the ones who need things to stay still and call that rules." He stopped near the edge of Maine and tilted his head, not in that way, not like him just enough to hear whatever he listens to. "They've found the edge of our lines," he said softly. They like edges. Can we write new ones? He breathed out through his nose, a sound like paper over a candle. We can hold old ones harder. And when they break? I asked. He didn't answer. He looked at his hands as if checking to make sure they were still there. In the dim light, I saw new dark stains on his cuffs. Fresh, the color of a bruise. Go home, he said. Tonight is not for curiosity. It wasn't for sleep either. At 9:03, a siren I had never heard before groaned once, half a note, and died. It wasn't police. It wasn't fire. It was old, like the metal whistle in the mill my father said used to call shifts in the 40s. It reached the right pitch, and then choked, as if someone had put a hand over its mouth. At 9:10, the lamppost hummed in a frequency that hurt the small bones in my ears. Not loud. Wrong. The cone of light around it tightened into a sharper circle, like the bulb had been turned inside out. I closed my eyes, and the hum vibrated across my eyelids as if it had fingers. At 9:14, the first door slammed 3 houses down, then another, the sound passing up the street in a wave, people finishing their checklists faster than usual, skipping small rituals in favor of the big ones. The square emptied 10 minutes early. I counted my steps and hated myself for counting. My house met me with a temperature that wasn't on the thermostat, and the smell of old apples when the skin starts to wrinkle. At 9:17, nothing happened exactly, which is sometimes worse. It should have been the edge between allowed and not, safety and teeth. It was just a second, small and round like a bead, rolling off the table into the dark. At 9:22, the knocking started everywhere. Not one door. All of them. Not polite. Hungry. A rattle of knuckles around the block like rain, and then each house answered with a tremor I felt through the floorboards, wood deciding whether to resist. It was not a drill. It was not practice. It was not any of the nights we'd survived by being still and stubborn. This was an inventory. The town was being checked for weak points. I did not answer. I sat with my back to the bedroom door, cloth tied around my head, hand on the covered hand mirror and the other pressed flat to the floor. The boards were warm. My bones were cold. Don't. A voice whispered at the keyhole. My name followed, pronounced with patience. Then my mother's laugh braided into it. Then my father's cough. Then a friend's slurred apology from 15 years ago. Then a sound like my voice imitating someone else's fear. None of it worked, because the rule worked. I didn't answer. But the timing kept sliding. The knocks lasted longer. The gaps between them shrank. The voice learned not to try names, and used pressures instead. A sure weight against the door as if the whole town leaned at once, then a careful easing like a hand learning exactly how much force to apply. By 10:06, the cicadas started and stopped 3 times. The third stop lasted 8 seconds. In that gap, something bunched the trees behind the houses like a curtain drawn tight, and then let go. The release rattled windows. The covered mirror breathed through its cloth. At 10:14, I heard shouts 2 houses down. Not screams, the sound people make when they realize they are losing something they can't hold by holding. I wanted to move. I did not. I have learned that leaving your house during someone else's knocking is like lighting a flare and waving it helpful to what is hunting, not to who is hunted. At 10:31, the stranger ran up Main with his backpack on both shoulders, head down, hands over his ears. He hit the pool of lamplight and stumbled, not at the light, at the dark inside it. He regained his balance on animal memory and kept going, a sound behind him like heels scraping concrete followed by fingertips drumming a satisfied rhythm on metal. He found a door, I don't know whose, and pounded. No one opened. He slid down the frame and tucked his head between his knees the way people do during takeoff. The knocking tracked past him, bored. I don't know when I fell asleep. Sometime after 11, I think. Not true sleep. The gray plateau where the body shuts down what it can and leaves a guard at the gate. When I woke, the room felt held at a new angle. The digital clock said 3:17. The air carried the sour sweet of fruit left in a car, and the window held a reflection it shouldn't, faint and wrong. The edges of my furniture doubled and wet-looking. The covered mirror had a dent in the cloth, a thumbprint shaped hollow. The tape at the top left corner had peeled with slow patience while I slept. A finger width of glass showed. I didn't look. I smoothed the cloth, retaped, nailed a thumbtack through fabric and frame. The metal met something thick and gave. Not wood, not silver. The tack went in anyway. I whispered evening toward the street because I needed the click inside again. It came. Small. Late. At dawn, the town wore the face of a person who had held too much weight on their back without asking for help. Doors were scuffed. Windows were scabbed with thumbprints. Salt lines were smeared into maps that meant nothing to me. People came outside and looked at each other too long, and then at the ground because eyes carry debt. The boards on Danny's door were marked. Scratches. Long, slow, deliberate. Not claws, not knives. Something harder than both, dragging in neat parallel lines across wood until the grain lifted. 4 fingers, then 3, then 2. Practice. "Don't look," Sheriff Mathers said from the sidewalk. "Not to me, not to anyone in particular. Don't put your attention where it will be used." "We need to repaint them," someone said dully. "We need to pray," someone else said. "We need to leave," said the stranger, and his voice cracked on the last word so that leave became 2 syllables, a plea and a promise that both knew they were lies. The sheriff didn't answer. He looked up at the lamppost the way you look at pain you've decided to accept, with a tired respect. "We stay," he said. "That's the pact." 2 families were missing by lunchtime, not households with a reputation for weakness, not the loud ones or the mean ones or the ones who for years had barely held their own rules in place. Quiet families, careful families. A mother and a father, and a boy with a scar on his chin. A woman who tended the cemetery, and her sister who kept tin foil over her windows every winter. Their cars were in their driveways. Their breakfasts were in their sinks. Their mirrors were covered. Their locks were locked. They were gone. People did not wail. They pressed their lips thin and had meetings. We're very good at meetings. In the church basement, the sheriff read the rules and folded the paper very slowly. And when he looked up, there were tears in his eyes he refused to let fall. "Mrs." Heron rang the bell 3 times, not the festival's cadence, but some older rhythm that meant, "We are still here, we are still here, we are." The last note clanged and fuzzed at the edges. The metal had a crack. You could hear it. "They're changing the rules," the watchman said from the back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words reached everyone with no effort, the way water finds the lowest place. He looked wrong, not broken, tilted. A man who had learned to stand against a specific wind, and now found the wind had shifted a degree, and his stance had to shift too. His coat cuffs were darker with new stains, up to the wrists now. "What do we do?" I asked, because I still believed in questions the way some people believe in cures. He met my eyes, and I let him. I braced for the cold marrow, for the dizzy feeling of someone reading my bones. Instead, I saw something else in his pale gaze, a limit, not of his patience, of his job. "When the rules break," he said, "so do we." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning. It was a fact delivered by a tired man who had always paid the bill quietly and now needed someone to see the amount due. That night, the lamppost man walked. You'll say he always walked. He must have moved to be where he was. But no. Before, he had been a fixed point. The town moved around him, seeing him taking steps, actual steps. The long, too smooth glide of a figure that did not bend at joints so much as pour itself forward, broke something in me I had been saving as my last clean thing. He went door to door, not knocking with knuckles, scraping, a slow rake across wood with something too long and too dry. You could hear the fibers surrender. He paused at each house long enough to teach it helplessness, and then moved on, humming just enough to keep the bones in our faces vibrating. Locks meant less when he stood on your porch, not because he could open them, but because you could feel how badly he didn't need to. He reached mine at 9:46. The scrape down my door was gentle, a trial. He didn't try for the knob. He didn't need a prize. He wanted to see if I would recite the rule under my breath and if the sound would make me feel smaller. It did. "Go away," I whispered, soft, useless, human. The scraping paused. The humming ceased. For a second I thought the town had gone deaf. Then he rapped the door once, a single strike hard enough to rattle the frame, and moved on, satisfied with the way my knees hit the floor. At 10:02, the stranger failed. I didn't see it. I saw the afterward. His numbered motel door open a hand's width, the mirror opposite the bed uncovered, the television on static. The sheriff stood in the parking lot with his paper in his hand, like he needed to read the rules to himself before he could do anything else. The watchman lingered by the stairs, head bowed, not in prayer, not in defeat, but in the posture of a man who has stayed long past his shift because no one else was coming. What happened? I asked the sheriff, because asking is my worst habit. It makes me feel like I can put a boundary around something by naming it. He learned too slow, he said. He gave permissions one by one, and then wondered why the door didn't respect degrees. We warned him, someone muttered behind me. It wasn't cruel, it was a bandage. We punished him, another voice said, not loud. A woman with a red scarf. We watched him be punished. No one argued. They didn't board his door. They left it as it was, open to the air, as if what had taken him might want to bring him back when it was done. No one believed that. We were just tired of hammering. By the next sunset, there were more small betrayals. The cicadas stuttered at 4:18 p.m. and stayed off 9 full seconds while the school bus turned at the corner. Children pressed their faces to the glass in a new silence that no one would call quiet. The bus driver didn't look at the woods. He looked at the road like it was the only thing he could keep real. Mirrors began to ripple under cloth if you said a name too clearly in the room. I stopped speaking full names. I referred to people by hooks. The woman with the red scarf. The boy with the chin scar. That neighbor. It felt like giving up pieces of them to keep the rest. The bell cracked for real that Thursday. Mrs. Heron lifted it to ring the first note, and the song came out with a hairline hiss and a grit that made everyone flinch. She looked at it and, for the first time, looked afraid. She set it down on the table like a kitten she'd realized was a snake and folded her hands in her lap. "We will use voices," she said, and the whole room said the rules with her, each word hitting the cold air and leaving fog. Never be outside after 9:17 p.m. Do not look directly at the man by the lamppost. If you hear knocking after midnight, never answer. Keep all mirrors covered at night. Never enter the woods when the cicadas are silent. Changing shape. I didn't know whether to take comfort from that. The lamppost man made 2 more rounds that night, circling blocks he'd ignored for decades. He scraped doors and hummed, and once, just once, knocked in a rhythm that matched a woman's heartbeat so exactly she fainted. He did not take her. He left her heavy and live on the floor. At 1:12 a.m., the cicadas went silent and did not come back for a full minute. The woods behind the houses breathed out and in. Some of the trees moved on a wind that wasn't blowing. In that minute, 3 dogs howled and 1 stopped, and the absence of the 4th voice was a chord I can still hear. I did not look outside. I sat in the dark and tried to learn what breathing is without thinking about it. I realized then what the rules had been all along. Not fences, not magic, not laws, delays, agreements. Enough friction to slow the teeth while the town figured out how to keep living. Not a cure. Never a cure. When the rules break, I repeated into the cloth at my ear, not as a question anymore. So do we. The house answered with a small settling sound that might have been wood, might have been yes. The next morning, the sheriff posted a fresh copy of the rules on the board. The flyer was the same, the words were the same, the paper was new enough to seem brave. People stood and read what they already knew because reading makes the world look like it still has instructions. A wind came down Main and lifted one corner of the flyer. It slapped the board twice, then lay flat. The lamppost hummed a half note lower, an itch in the jawbone again. Far down the street, the watchman stopped and put a hand to the side of his head, as if to steady something inside it. He turned, looking not at the lamppost, not at me, but at the space between us where our breath hung. "Hold them," he said, as if I could give his order to the town. I went home and closed the door and whispered them into the wood until I felt the words sit in the grain. 9:17. Do not look, do not answer, cover, never enter, always greet. I didn't know how long they would hold. I only knew that holding was what we had. Outside, the lamppost man took another step. The night after the rules began breaking, Hollow Creek felt like a house with its windows open to a storm. Every sound was wrong. The cicadas sang and stopped and sang again in stuttering waves, no longer holding their steady wall of noise. Knocking came before midnight, after midnight, in the middle of the day, sometimes soft, sometimes like a fist pounding in rage. The mirrors rippled through their cloths, not waiting for gaps anymore. Even the salt I'd laid across the threshold smeared itself into strange shapes overnight, as if dragged by an unseen palm. I sat in the living room with every light off, whispering the rules to myself, but they had stopped sounding like anchors. They sounded like riddles I no longer knew the answers to. At 12:09, the watchman came. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, coat heavier with dark stains, his face hollow as if something inside him had been scooped out. His pale eyes looked thinner, less sure. "You're still here," I said, voice cracking. He shook his head slowly. "Not for long." "What do we do?" I asked. "The rules, they don't work anymore." I tried. He raised a trembling hand. His voice was quieter than the rain dripping outside. "There is one more, never written, not given to children, because it ends us as much as it saves." I leaned forward. My throat was dry enough to burn. "Tell me." "When all 6 fail," he whispered. "The last one is this: leave Hollow Creek and never look back." The words sat in the air like smoke that wouldn't rise. I wanted to cry with relief and answer, a way out. But then I thought about the stranger who had tried to leave, about how the road looped him back to the dented stop sign, about how Hollow Creek doesn't let go once it has your name written in its air. "How?" I asked, and my voice broke on the word. The watchman's eyes dropped to the floor. His jaw clenched. "Run. Sometimes the town is tired enough to let one slip through. You must not turn, not even to check the sun. If you look back," his mouth twitched like he didn't want to finish, "then you don't leave alone." A scrape echoed at the front door. Long, slow, deliberate. The lamppost man. His humming slid through the walls like a tuning fork pressed to bone. I grabbed the bag I'd kept half-packed since the first week water. A flashlight. My notes. My mother's photograph. My hands shook so badly I could hardly zip it. "Go," the watchman rasped. His body bent forward like he was being pushed by a hand no one else could see. His coat bled at the seams. While I can still stand, I ran. The front door burst open into a night that wasn't right. The streets twisted longer than they should have, houses repeated, and the lamppost stood at every corner like a reflection trying on different places. I ran anyway. Each step counted, each breath tearing. Behind me, knocks chased on pavement, on glass, on the back of my skull. Voices called me. My mother, my father, Danny, even my own voice begging me to stop. I didn't. The woods closed in. The cicadas shrieked, then cut, then shrieked again. The silence between their cries thick with something crawling, massive, too many limbs moving in the trees. I kept running, ignoring the urge to turn and look. My eyes burned with the need. Curiosity is hunger in disguise. Finally, the highway appeared, blacktop stretching out into pale horizon. Relief punched my chest so hard I sobbed. I crossed onto it, shoes slapping tar, lungs shredded, and still I didn't look back. But the road curved. It always curves. And when it did, there he was, the lamppost man, standing in the middle of the asphalt, head tilted, body too tall for the space he took. His shadow stretched both ways down the road, into past and future alike. I staggered, nearly fell. The voices surged again. "Just one glance. Just check. Just be sure you're really free." I squeezed my eyes shut and kept moving. My feet slapped the pavement. My breaths rasped like torn paper. I thought, if I can make it to sunrise, I'll live. If I can just... The air bent. The road bent. I felt Hollow Creek fold itself around me like paper around a flame. I don't remember falling. I remember recording. The little tape recorder from the library archive sat in my bag. My hand found it. My thumb pressed play, and I spoke through sobs. If anyone finds this, there are 6 rules in Hollow Creek. Break one, and you might disappear. Break them all, and you'll learn the last. Leave. Don't look back. Never. The tape cut off. On the last few seconds, faint but certain, the sound of knocking continues. Soft, steady, endless. And then silence.